President Bush makes a surprise visit to Iraq to shore up his case that security is getting better. Meanwhile, the Iraqi government sacks thousands of policemen with possible links to armed militias. So who's feeling the heat as America's top general prepares his report on progress in Iraq? Is it all too little, too late? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. Well, President Bush's visit could be seen as an attempt to shore up the US troop surge, but it coincides with the withdrawal of British troops from Basra City, something which is bound to be an irritant for US commanders. And all this just days before America's top soldier in Iraq releases his report on progress on the ground. Mohammed Shakir looks at the impact now of President Bush's visit.
This is his third visit to Iraq, but this time he is not alone. The Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor accompanied him. The Defense Secretary arrived in Iraq ahead of Bush, which makes this visit look like a summit gathering the war administration in the crisis location. The assembly comes only 1 week before the release of the Patriot Crocker report that details the American strategy in Iraq. This makes this gathering a decisive one, as described by senior members in the Pentagon. Bush needs to review his strategy on the ground in a Sunni area that was not chosen by coincidence. Al-Anbar province was Saddam Hussein's power base with a 95% Sunni population and has been classified by America as the stronghold of Sunni insurgents. It's also the place that its people turned against Al-Qaeda instead of the Americans. Therefore, it is seen as the city that was recruited by the Americans to face Al-Qaeda, which turns Al-Anbar province into a success story against insurgents.
Welcome. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you.
But Bush's happiness with the calmness in Al-Anbar coincides with the withdrawal of the British troops from Basra, the second largest city in Iraq. A few days earlier, Al-Mahdi army announced the freezing of its activities for 6 months, a move that secured a face-saving withdrawal for the British troops. British Prime Minister described the organized evacuation and leaving of the Basra Palace to the city airport as a planned decision and not a defeat. The withdrawal comes amid tension between London and Washington over the troops' level in Iraq. Gordon Brown may not have clearly stated that the strategic alliance between the US and Britain has reached a turning point, but this is the way it looks.
Well, joining us now are guests from Baghdad, Al-Makki, a member of parliament representing the Sunni Accordance Front. In Doha, Marwan Bishara, Al Jazeera's senior Middle East analyst. And on the line from London, Peter Felsteed, editor of Jane's Defence Weekly. Welcome to the programme, gentlemen. Peter Felsteed in London, let me start with you on the phone there, if I may, first. President Bush's visit came on the same day that British forces withdrew from their base in Basra. What do you think is behind the pullout and why now?
Well, this was always part of a scheduled plan, and if you look at the way the Brits have pulled out in other parts of the areas they've held, you can see that it fits part of the pattern that was always intended to be.
So where does this now leave the British plan for stabilisation in the south, and what sort of role do you see the British soldiers playing there now?
Well, they will be largely confined to the airport outside of Basra City. They will be able to deploy in support of the Iraqis if their help is requested. Otherwise, they will remain within that area, and it will be very much a case of overwatch and further training of the Iraqi security forces.
Al-Makki in Baghdad, let me bring you in here. Why do you think President Bush chose Anbar province for his visit, and what message do you think he was trying to send out?
Well, I think this visit for President Bush gives 3 or more messages. First of all, it's a message to American people and American politicians that Mr. Bush had achieved success in security in Anbar. So it's a base for more success in other areas, and he's preparing the atmosphere for the Patriots report. Secondly, it's a negative message to Iranian government that Iraqi people is very much unwilling this infiltration and Iranian effects, so Iran should pull out. And thirdly, it give a message to the Iraqi government It's a negative message because he didn't visit Baghdad, but he went to Anbar, saying to al-Maliki and the security man that success is here, and it wasn't achieved by the government, it was achieved by people, Anbar people, with cooperation with the MNF and other forces like the Tawafuk Front in really in Anbar, cooperating with the process. And really, I feel it's important for Mr. Bush in Washington and in America rather than in Iraq.
OK, let's bring in Marwan Bishara in Doha. Marwan, in his speech, Mr. Bush told his troops that fighting insurgents on the sands of Anbar province would make the streets of America a much safer place. I mean, is that a questionable proposition, do you think?
His speech, just like his visit, sounds to us, people in the media or in academia, as yet another spin. The spin doctors around the Bush administration are selling us another war, something like the reoccupation of Iraq, if you will, just like they sell us, that's like they sold us 4 years ago, the war in Iraq being a catwalk, something that would be successful. That's something like the mission accomplished within few weeks, only to be sunk into a war of 4 years and, of course, ongoing. So this visit and this speech was meant to, of course, tell us all in the media that there is room for success and that time was on the side of America, when time really has been on the side of destruction and death in Iraq. Just when the South is basically unraveling into a failed state, and when the North is unraveling into Sunni-Sunni war. Basically, 4 wars now are taking over in Iraq. The President of the United States wants to tell us that there is success and that the US forces should continue and that Congress should give him another $50 billion. It's a sad repeat of what we saw 4 years ago.
OK, let's bring back Peter Felsen in London here. I mean, Peter, how much is there a tactical disparity between the offensive operations by the Americans in Baghdad on the one hand and the withdrawal to base by the British on the other?
Well, they are facing 2 different situations. That the Americans around Baghdad and what was formerly the Sunni Triangle is quite a different situation to that faced by the British down in Basra. So we can only look at that and accept that they are different tactics. Having said that, I must agree that the American perspective on how things would turn out post-conflict was, with hindsight, remarkably naive.
Al-Maki in Baghdad, let me bring you in here again, because there are reports that the US has armed 12,000 Sunni tribesmen in and around Baghdad. Are we witnessing a change of attitude by US troops towards local people? I mean, have they stopped seeing them as a threat and more as an ally, do you think?
Well, basically, we here in Iraq regard that the Americans in the first months and first years of occupation, they dealt with Iraqi people as enemies in general, especially in the hot areas, which is Anbar and Salahuddin and others. And really, they were even, the American soldiers hit the families and females, women. So they realized that it was a wrong attitude. And they sent the governmental National Guard. And the governmental National Guard also, it was sectarian and failed in this context. And now the secret is they are dealing with the people themselves, supporting Iraqi people themselves, making Iraqi people able to defend themselves against the illegally armed people, especially Al-Qaeda and the militias. And this was really a successful step, and Mr. Bush visit put a stamp on this and say this is okay, and it's a successful step. And there are efforts in Diyala and efforts in Salahuddin even to go ahead with Iraqi people to support them against Al-Qaeda there and against militias. I think if this transferred to even southern provinces, I think the picture will be changed also, because governmental army will fail facing Iraqi people, as was in Karbala and so on, and Diwania and Nasriya We need to speak, we need to support, we need to meet the tribes, the people themselves, and cooperate with them. I think this is the successful plan in the near future.
All right, let's just bring in back Marwan Bishara there for a second. Marwan, there's no coincidence, is there, in the timing of President Bush's trip? It happened on the same day that British forces withdrew from Basra. Where does this leave the military relationship between the two allies? Because some observers say it's rather prickly.
Well, for sure. I think the British, of course, as an ex-colonial power in the Middle East, have realized, and as you know, Darren, we've heard ex-chief of staff of the British Army and other generals, senior generals, talking about Rumsfeld and Bush as intellectually bankrupt and about the mess that the Pentagon has created in Iraq. The Brits are extremely unhappy with the way the war has gone, especially, of course, in the south. But this is the problem, Darren. What we're seeing today in Al-Anbar province is a repeat of what we saw in the Shiite areas and regions in Iraq. What did we see? In 2005, 2 years after the war seemed to be failing in Iraq, the US administration went on and started arming militias, Shiite militias, in order to fight the so-called Sunni insurgencies. Within weeks, we've seen tens, hundreds of dead Sunnis, Iraqis in general, being thrown in the streets. And since then, tens of thousands of people have died because of the way the Bush administration armed those Shiite militias. Today, the Bush administration is doing exactly the same in the Sunni areas. It's arming so-called tribal regional forces. It's actually another form of militias fighting another or other Sunni tribes that presumably be prescribed to Al-Qaeda thinking. But in the end of the day, what we have is an attempt to basically arm an Iraqi army, but at the same time dissolving, unraveling the state into tens of militias all around the country. This is becoming the wild, wild west in Iraq.
OK, Marwan, I want to get a final thought from Peter Felstead before he has to go. Peter, some critics say the British withdrawal is an admission of sorts that the kind of role they were playing at Basra Palace was no longer effective. What's your response to that?
Well, I don't really agree that it was a failure, but I think at the same time the British military commanders have recognised the limits as to what they could achieve. When the Brits first went into the south, they used their traditional methods in actually patrolling without helmets, trying to get the local populace on board, and eventually that in a sense has failed because the level of the violence meant that they had to put their helmets back on and conduct themselves perhaps more in a way that the Americans would normally have conducted themselves. But I think they realize the limits of what can be achieved and the fact that it's their presence in itself which will create a certain level of violence, because no country is going to want to be occupied regardless who that is.
All right, Peter Felstead, thank you for your time. We have to leave it there with you. Well, it's time for a short break now, but when we come back, as President Bush tries to stay the course, is the Iraqi government running out of time to heal the political divide? Stay with us.